Our guest today is a lecturer here at Mays Business School, the founder of a local nonprofit addressing human trafficking, an acclaimed author, an avid runner. Chris Field, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Ben. How about you?
I'm doing really well. It's another beautiful day in Aggieland, and we are really pleased and honored to have you on the show.
Well, thank you.
We'll start with our usual question that we open with. You are a man of many interests, a man of many talents. If you could choose a superpower, though, what is your favorite superpower?
So I'm going to kind of go off script to start us off here today. And I'm going to say the superpower I would love to have is being able to know every person's story that I encounter. I feel like when I know someone's story, I have so much more empathy for them. And I'm much more likely to be kind and to be understanding. But from a life perspective, it also informs so much of how to interact with that person, what buttons to push, what things get them excited. So yeah, I think that would be my superpower, is somehow being able to internalize and immediately know the story of the person I'm encountering.
So my follow-up question is, how would that show up for you? Like, would you hear it? Would it show up as like you see the Matrix, like the code like runs over the person's face? Would it be like a bubble next to their head? Like, how would that manifest for you?
I think it would be like a really deep LinkedIn profile where you sort of saw their greatest and worst moments all at one time, right? Maybe you knew, I love the Brandon Stanton, Humans of New York, when they asked him, how do you get these great stories from people? And he said, the question I always ask is, what's your greatest struggle right now? And that just draws out a level of vulnerability in people immediately, sort of disarms them. And so I think understanding like, what is this person's greatest fear? What drives them? What motivates them? What gets them excited? What makes them get out of bed in the morning? It takes years for us to get there with each other, usually in relationship. But if you knew that from the beginning, like, hey, my greatest fear is that you'll think my idea is stupid, that you would interact with that person differently when they gave you that idea, right? Or my greatest fear is that my parents never gave me affirmation, or that I'm not as smart as everybody else in the room, or whatever that thing is. If you immediately knew that, you could disarm that and really work hard to make sure they felt affirmed in that thing or didn't feel that fear. And then I think you could start on level 7 in the relationship instead of level 1. Be pretty efficient as well.
To me, that level 7 question, then the thing that then takes you to like the higher dimension of understanding is, so I love the greatest fear question. And the greatest struggle question as well. Those are both great. And then to me, what moves it then even up the ladder of like higher understanding and the things that separate us from the animals is then what makes you overcome that fear?
That's right.
Like what makes you brave is the best way I've found to capture that one. And understanding the things that make us rise above what we were born into. Yeah. And some are more fortunate than others in the sense of having less that they have to rise above. You know, we've talked many, many times about that, but the idea of what helps you access your greater nature to me is one of the really fascinating ones.
Absolutely.
So before we get into your backstory, let's start with your current affiliation with Mays. So this is your 4th year as a lecturer at the business school. Now, I'm most familiar with higher educators as research-oriented professionals. What is it like doing just the teaching side? Like, how involved do you feel in the workings of the business school?
Yeah, so I think I don't have anything to compare it to, of course, but for me, I think I have the best of all the worlds. I'm not really involved in the day-to-day of Mays. I mean, I know who the dean is, and I know pretty much that's it. So I'm not having to go to meetings. I'm not having to worry about some of those things. You know, everyone has to play the game when it comes to rules and processes and regulations. And obviously higher ed is, I mean, it's a beast, right? There's lots of red tape and all of that. And some of it's important, some of it's not, but nobody gets to decide which of those is which. And so you just got to play the game. Mm-hmm. What I get is time every week with 20 to 25 students. Mm-hmm. And what I love about the class, which is using business to solve social problems is the name of the class, is that most of the students who come into the class, they're obviously all very smart. They're in the business school, very driven, very talented, almost all of them come from families that have high expectations of what their kids will become, all of that. But
to clarify, this is mostly or all undergrads?
All undergrads, yeah. Mostly juniors and seniors, I would say, the majority. Some sophomores, and every once in a while, somehow a freshman sneaks in. I don't even know how that happens, but I don't even care. It's not my job to care about that. Great. They show up in my class, I'm ready to teach them.
Great that they made it in.
But what I love about it is that the class, because I'm sort of an atypical professor or I'm not as engaged in the bigger pieces of higher ed, is that it's become sort of this moment to take a breath, I feel like, in the business school, and to help them remember that they're human and that they're not these analytical business machines, that they all have these fears and hopes and dreams. And even that with their business degrees, this generation, they want to be meaningful and they want to do something that matters. And so I feel like every week we get to sort of say, hey, I know you've been doing all this other big stuff. You've been studying for finance and you've been getting beat down in accounting and you're trying to decide what's next. Hold all that for a second and let's remember what makes you feel most alive. Because it's not accounting for most of them. Accounting is a vehicle to get them to what feels most alive, but typically they don't wake up wanting to do accounting all day. They want to do people. And they want to do meaning and they want to do purpose and they want to have lives that count. And so we get to sort of draw all those incredible assets of business, which all matter a lot in the world, and talk about solving problems that really matter and talk about how to leverage those things. So I love it, man. The relationships, we're actually having all my students over for dinner tonight. I love the chance to invest in them and to pour into their lives and to be a mentor and an asset to them as they kind of figure out what the heck they're doing. So
you asked a great question that I'm going to turn around on you. What makes you feel most alive?
Yeah, for me, I love solving problems. I mean, I take it as such a challenge when somebody says, I don't think we're going to be able to figure this out. It's like, nothing makes me want to roll my sleeves up more than when somebody feels like there's something that can't be overcome. So I love solving problems and I love people. I mean, I really do. I love people. I love people who are, I think I especially love people who've sort of been written off or pushed aside or sort of told they're not enough, or maybe even that they have something in them that they can't even see themselves, and being able to draw that out of people and being able to find and identify those qualities. So yeah, I think those are the two things that probably motivate me the most.
I had a coworker 12 years ago who used to really love saying it is what it is. And another coworker who used to say every time that Brad, who I think is at Missouri now, I think he was the offensive line coach at Missouri this year. He was at Florida previously. And so every time Brad would say this, another coworker named Mike would say, but does it have to be what it is? And Mike is now the head coach at Rice. He was the offensive coordinator at Stanford for several years. And he and I were GAs together here at A&M for like 3 weeks or whatever. And then he got a job with the New York Jets. His story is fascinating. But so his perspective was always sort of the same as yours, which is what makes it what it is. He would get very meta about it. And does it have to be that way?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what can we do to keep it from being that way if this thing, that whatever it is that we're talking about, is something that we don't like?
That's right.
So, okay, let's back up. So tell us a little bit about growing up here. There's sort of a recurring theme among some of our recent guests, which is having ties to College Station. How is College Station the same as when you were in school here, elementary school, college for a little bit? How is it the same? How is it different?
Wow. So, I mean, Texas A&M has always been such a focal point of College Station. You know, even back in the 80s, we moved here in 1986. My dad got a job as a programmer. Moved here from Houston. I was 4 years old. And, you know, even back then, enrollment at A&M was in the 30,000s in the 80s. So like a lot of people think the large enrollment of A&M is like a new phenomenon. I mean, to have over 30,000 5,000 students in the mid 80s is insane. I mean, that was huge.
Yeah.
So I think Texas A&M has always been a focal point of this community. It is what it is because of Texas A&M. I think the things that's changed, two things I would point out, and one of these has definitely changed. You can look at a map and tell, and that's just the growth of the city. I mean, the growth south, the growth east, the growth west. I mean, the city has exploded in population. It's exploded in homes and just families and so many students. When you have 35,000 students graduating every year, and most of them or many of them would love to stay here because they like it, you're just going to have this inevitable growth. And then you have so many Aggies now who are coming back to retire in College Station because they went to Houston, they went to Austin, they went to Dallas, they did their thing, and now they want to be somewhere smaller. They want to, get back to a sort of a small town feel. So I think the growth is the obvious thing that's changed. And I always joke, but it's not really a joke. When I was a kid, Rock Prairie was the furthest south of town we would ever go. I mean, I played baseball at the baseball fields on Rock Prairie, and I remember, I remember when it'd be a baseball game day, and my parents would say, we got to get ready to go to the game. It's like packing for Oregon Trail. I was like, okay, I got to get some trail mix, and let me get a book and some water just in case. You never know what's going to happen between now and there. It's a long ways, guys. Bring a blanket. And so now I would say Rock Prairie is basically the center of town at most. I mean, that it's not far south by any measure of what's actually south. Now, students may consider it further south, but for families, I mean, Rock Prairie is kind of right in the center of College Station.
That's true for that residential.
So that
area,
that feels totally crazy as far as the growth. The other piece is probably something that's just the way my perception has changed, but I'm fascinated as I get older and as my professional life evolves at the talent, the sheer number of brilliant people who live in College Station. I mean, I'm meeting these professional people who are renowned around the world, not all affiliated with Texas A&M. Of course, we've got faculty and staff who are world renowned, but public speakers and leadership gurus. I mean, there's just people in College Station that I had no idea existed, live here that are just brilliant people and some of the most well-known in their various fields. So I think College Station it's viewed as a small town, I understand, and by most measures it is fairly small, but the brain trust here and the amount of talent and skills of so many people live here, it's pretty incredible the amount of knowledge that resides in this pretty small space.
It's fascinating to me how you probably heard this being here in the 90s. People would say there's, quote, nothing to do here. And I always wondered, so me being the naive kid that I was at the time, I was like, we have a movie theater. We have some decent restaurants, which might have not been quite true.
We had a
back
Chili's.
then. We had a Chili's.
Yeah. And Bennigan's.
A Bennigan's. We unfortunately no longer have a Bennigan's.
No, rip.
But now I feel like we do have a lot of great food options. We have Century Square now. We have downtown Bryan. To me, so College Station is now the same size that Austin was in about 1960, which to me suggests, knock on wood, that we're at a really interesting evolutionary point in the city's history. And I've probably made this point before. I think the next 50 years will be a really fascinating time for this community. I hope that we take the maybe painful steps that other larger cities did not take to establish infrastructure at a time when it was more difficult to justify, so that you don't end up in a spot where now you really need that infrastructure and it's too late.
Too late. Yeah.
It's too late. LA was sort of always going to be a mess because you can't build up, because every now and then the ground moves. So there's not a whole lot to do there. But in Texas, we have space.
Right.
So when a city is clearly going to grow, is growing explosively and is going to continue to do so, you have options.
Yeah.
You just have to implement them early at a time when, again, it may be difficult to justify.
And that's gonna take a lot of forward thinking by people who have not always been pegged as forward thinking, So I think it's going to take some humility and some really strong leadership by people in the cities and the counties. And honestly, it's going to take people working together better than it's probably usually happened. There's always been this knock. I remember when I started the marathon, which I think we'll get to later, but
yes,
everyone told me, "Oh, you'll never get Bryan and College Station and Texas A&M to work together. It's impossible. No one likes to work together." And it was like, how is that even possible in a town? We basically function as one town. Like, I know everybody has their geographic, lines that tell them what they can and can't do. It's like, we are one town. I mean, this is BCS, is including Texas A&M. It's really one town. And what's good for Bryan is good for College Station, and what's good for A&M is good for Bryan and College Station, and what's good for Bryan and College Station is good for A&M. I mean, it's a very cyclical, sort of relationship. Yeah. And when people said that, I was like, I literally don't even know how that's possible. How could they not work together? But not that I've necessarily seen it with the marathon, but as I've gotten further into that, you see those places where it feels more like competition and more like there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser.
Zero sum.
And people are going to have to get past that to be able to put in some of this infrastructure like you're referencing.
So you do have a history of, there's this thing about you where it's very easy for you to, when someone gets around you, you have a presence that is very positive and warming. It's very easy for someone to feel like you are on their side and you also have their interests in mind. So I don't know if that's just some sort of like kind of unique magic about you, but I can imagine that you would be able to get buy-in on things. And true to form, you were able to get buy-in on this thing that other people had a lot of trouble with. And I think it's in part because of that. But I'm going to throw you a curveball here, because you also enjoy, as you said earlier, when someone says it can't be done, your response is that pings your radar, right. And your response is, okay, well, I'm going to go do it. Yeah. One of the examples of this that we did not have in our discussion questions was you ran for mayor at a very young age. What prompted you to do that, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, it was exactly what you said. At the time, there was 2 70-year-old candidates. I was 19, reading the newspaper, a freshman in college, and I thought, this is silly that in a town of this age, where the average age, even excluding college students, there's just so many 30-somethings in this town. This was back in 2002, spring of 2002, that there was no one under 70 years old running for mayor. So I drove down to City Hall, and I didn't know what you had to do to sign up back in the time. So I just went inside and found the city secretary, and I said, good afternoon. I'm here to sign up to run for mayor. And she smiled really sweetly and said, well, maybe you should consider city council. And I said, I appreciate the suggestion. I think I'll go for mayor. What do I need to do? And she said, she fumbled around on her desk, pulled out some form and looked at me very sternly and said, you have to have a campaign treasurer. And I said, I got a buddy named Tristan who would be a fantastic campaign treasurer. Can you tell me what a campaign treasurer does? I just want to make sure. Really smart guy, freshman engineering. I mean, I got a lot of confidence in him. And she quasi-laughed and just gave me the form, and I filled it out. And next day I was on the front page of the Eagle as local student files to run for mayor, and ended up getting 3rd out of 5 in that election. And I think what I learned from that election, this was actually going to be my greatest failure if we ever got to that topic. But my takeaway from that election, even though I lost, was that we create these paper mache sort of boundaries around ourselves that we feel like are made of solid material, but really they're just waiting to be punched through. And one of those things is why not? Why not me? And that became, I had 3 things that happened over a 6-month period my freshman year of college. I ran my first marathon, untrained, chasing a girl. I ran for mayor of College Station, got 3rd out of 5. And I was asked to be the director of a camp for inner city kids with 50 staff and 600 young people every summer. And so all of a sudden in that 6-month period, it was like all of these things that people would have said were impossible or too hard or nobody your age should or could. I was doing them. I was right in the middle of that world. And so all of a sudden it was like this filter fell down for me. And it was like, wait, they say I can't do that. And they say I can't do that. And they say no one should do that. And you have to be 30 to do that. Like, who's making all these stupid rules? Like, where are the people making the rules? Like, there's no rules. It's us. We're putting those constraints on ourselves. And so what other constraints have I put on myself? And so then when you begin to think in those terms, all of a sudden the whole world opens up. And then it doesn't become, the question shifts from, oh, I wonder if I can do that, to which of these things do I do? Right? It's no longer, oh gosh, that would be really neat. It's like, gosh, I could literally do like today, I could literally try to accomplish anything I wanted to accomplish. And over time, you begin to get enough momentum and confidence that you don't it's not far-fetched. You're like, oh, I could actually probably do that thing. And maybe not. But I'm not going to not try because someone says I shouldn't try, right?
When you preach that message to people,
yeah.
How do you feel? Do you feel it helps you or hurts you to be coming from a place of being a straight white man, where sometimes as a straight white guy, especially in a business setting, there are times when just the best answer is just walk in like you own the place,
right, and
just start talking. And because you look the part, people will listen to you.
Sure.
Now, and you and I would agree that that's inherently kind of a bad thing, that the playing field is uneven in that way.
Of course.
But what I'm asking is, so when you preach this message of subverting expectations and overcoming boundaries, do you feel like that particular thing is aided or hindered by coming from a place of privilege as you do?
I think it probably depends on my audience, right? I think my friends who are people of color and struggling, they hear that message in a totally different sort of way than when I'm speaking to white college students. So I think it's still, if I'm doing a good job telling that story, particularly relating it to the context I find myself in, I think it still feels empowering for people that are struggling or that are people of color or that are low income or whatever the thing may be that's different from me and to them. But it certainly feels different to them because there is a tendency, and sometimes they'll say it to me like, well, yeah, but Chris, of course you can sign up to run for mayor. I don't even know where, I don't have a car to even drive to City Hall or to even know where City Hall is in this town. And it's like, okay, that's a fair point, right? And so I think the audience, it's very dependent on the audience, but I don't think I don't know if I would say it helps or hurts my message. I'm very aware of my privilege, or I try to be as aware of my privilege as I can be.
Sure.
I also don't let it overwhelm me because I can't go backwards, right? I can't be less privileged because my privilege bothers me. So what I can be is really honest about my privilege. And like even my 8-year-old daughter, we already have conversations with her about the privilege we have. And that is conversations. I love my parents, but they weren't having conversations. They didn't even know that language. They did the best they knew how. They didn't even know language of privilege when I was a kid. No one was talking about that, right? And so I want my kids to understand privilege better than I did. And I want to be honest about those limitations, but also not use it as an excuse not to continue engaging in some of the hard stuff.
Sure. One of the best speakers I've ever heard was Mattress Mac, Jim Mackingvale. He came and spoke with a sport marketing class that I took in college at Rice. And I wasn't expecting much. I was expecting him to talk really fast and Gallery Furniture will save you money today. Come on
sell
down.
you a mattress.
And instead, he was the total opposite of his commercial persona. He walked in and he spoke slowly and he had this kind of deep voice, which I also did not expect. And he talked about walking on as a football player at the University of Texas. And he said, there were only 2 problems. I was too small and I was too slow.
That's awesome.
And I remember like the timbre and the cadence of the way that he spoke. And this guy just held our whole class in the palm of his hand for 50 straight minutes. And the phrase he kept coming back to was, "How lucky are we?" And he had this deep intonation, and like you could tell that he was considering the question in a very real way every single time he asked it. And that was my first brush with being aware of your own privilege as an adult.
Right.
My parents would talk about, the idea that we're really lucky. And it was sort of like, it was kind of like something that you heard at church, like treat others the way you want to be treated. And as a kid, you know that that's the right thing to do, but you're not entirely sure why.
Right.
The real reason that you want to do that is because if everybody does it that way, that puts you in the best possible equilibrium from a behavioral standpoint. But as a kid, you just know that's what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
This was sort of the same thing where I thought in terms of we're really lucky, but I'm not quite sure why.
Right.
And then hearing this guy talk for 50 minutes about all of the wonderful things that we have around us and the idea that other people don't have those same things was transformative.
Yeah,
like that lecture was something I'll never forget. And Mattress Mac. So if you're out there, Jim, thanks.
Yeah, and I think
you are out there.
I think the shift, Ben, is moving from how lucky are we to what do we do with that now?
Sure.
Right. And I think we've done okay at the conversation of, hey, we have some privilege. Let's accept that and acknowledge that. Okay. And now what do we do with our privilege? What do we do in higher education with our privilege? How do we think about and talk about and respond to that privilege in a way that's meaningful to people who don't have privilege? Because, it's like a friend of mine said he didn't vote for a number of years because he was so fed up with the political system. And then he said he realized even the fact that he could choose not to vote was a sign of his privilege. He didn't need to vote, he felt like, because it didn't directly affect him.
Yeah.
That was a privilege. Not being directly affected by policies and politicians was a privilege he had as a straight white male. And it was not shared by so many of his neighbors. And so he still doesn't care about politics, but he cares about speaking up for those who don't have his privilege, right? So now he votes for a totally different reason. And I think voting aside, how do we do what we do as people? How do we live? How do we choose our behavior? How do we choose our actions, our activity? How do we choose to spend our time and our money and our gifts and our talents and our energy? And is it in response to knowing we are lucky and we have been given much and we've been very fortunate, whatever, blessed, whatever word somebody wants to use, we've been given a lot. And so will we give those gifts back to the world in a way that is responsive to understanding the privilege that we have instead of just acknowledging it, it seems like that's where we often stop is, okay, sure, I've been very lucky. I'll acknowledge it. But then now, what happens now?
Right. And so you have spent a good piece of your life answering that question. So let's walk through your educational and professional history. Tell us about, you started off at Texas A&M in 2001. You mentioned the race for mayor. But let's talk about education, theology, your professional history a little bit.
Yeah. So
give the audience some context.
Yeah. So I was a pretty terrible student in high school, to be totally honest. I was fairly intelligent, but very little drive, did not work hard, graduated 40th percentile of my class at A&M Consolidated High School.
To be fair, A&M Consolidated, especially A&M Consolidated, a brutally competitive.
Yeah, it was tough, but I should not have finished 40th percentile for sure. So I didn't put much effort in, took virtually no honors classes, took the SAT once my sophomore year and then didn't care ever to take it again. So I squeaked into A&M only on the blend team, A&M blend partnership. And so I was here, was doing that, and then we started directing the camp for inner city kids, discovered that passion for sort of the least of these and this vulnerable population that I had interacted with here in College Station, but had never really considered what life really meant for people of color and for people of low income. And so all of a sudden that sort of turned my world upside down. So I came back here after that my freshman year, I ran for mayor, but I also got a job at the Boys and Girls Club. And that was really formative because the camp was great, but we only had the kids a week. And so being able to actually like walk alongside these kids day after day after day through sort of the cycle of life, over a year, over a school year, was really formative for me. So I realized I wanted to do ministry, transferred to Abilene Christian in Abilene, which is a seminary university, got my bachelor's degree in Christian ministry, which is kind of the preaching homiletics degree. And then through that time, kept directing the camp for inner city kids. Graduated from there, thought I wanted to be a lawyer, to do like poverty law. Did really well in the LSAT. I worked really hard in college, sort of found that drive and my passion. And so in college, I was graduated summa cum laude, like actually worked really hard and used my intelligence and all of that. So did really well in the LSAT, got a full ride to Texas Tech for law school, went to Texas Tech for law school, hated law school, quit law school, was sort of searching for what was next. Actually spent about 6 months with my in-laws starting a car dealership in Lawrence, Kansas, if you can believe it. So,
I can.
Yeah. So over that 6 months, I was a car salesman, a car sales manager, F&I guy, which is the people you sign the papers with that try to sell you all the extra stuff in the back. So I did all of that over 6 months, hated it just as much as you can imagine I would have. Came back to College Station where I was a youth pastor. Then I got a job as a preacher at a small church in Dallas. And then that led me to reading the book about child trafficking, which led me to Ghana, which led me to Mercy Project. And along the way in there, I got my master's degree in seminary as well from ACU.
So the genesis of Mercy Project, which is where we're going next, the genesis of that was reading a book.
It was, yeah. It was a book called Jansen's Gift. And it was really a memoir of a woman who lost her 15-year-old son. Suddenly he came home from football practice, took a nap on the couch and never woke up. He had an undetectable heart ailment and he just passed away in his sleep. And so she goes from this perfectly healthy child to, no child and just the grief. And at the time, I was probably 25 when I read the book, and I'd been doing ministry for a number of years, but it was one of the most raw sort of dealings with grief that I'd ever read. I mean, just her being honest about the pain of that death of her child and the way people came around her and what was helpful in her grief and what was not helpful in her grief still shapes the way I interact with grieving people today. I mean, I get called up to the hospital occasionally to do volunteer chaplaincy stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm still shaped when I'm standing in a room with a family whose father just took their last breath and they're wailing. Mm-hmm. I'm still shaped by remembering in her book, her just talking about what she needed was just people who would stand there with her. They didn't need to have good words. They didn't need to have good prayers. She just needed people to be there. And so even in that moment when the family is grieving their father, and I feel so inadequate, particularly in a chaplain situation where you literally don't know anything. I don't even know the family's name, right? At that point, I'm like, oh my gosh, did they say Jones or Smith? Or because I walk out of the elevator and the nurse is like, he's taking his last breaths right now. Could you room 327? I don't even know this family's name. I don't know why this guy's sick. I know nothing. I have nothing to give in that moment except my presence. Yeah. They needed a person of faith.
Right.
And I'm a person of faith who showed up at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night and they just want to see me.
It's you and them. There's no prep team.
No.
You don't have a PA who comes up and hands you the dossier.
Oh yeah, there's no doctor. I mean, it's just me. And and so it's just, and that's only happened a few times, but I always remember that book that she just made such an important point over and over and over that it was the people who just showed up that was so meaningful to her, not the ones who tried to placate her feelings or God has this or we should pray like that. Or, we have a really bad theology around death in America and we just say really stupid stuff. And it was like, hey, just the people who showed up. That's what I remembered is just the people who showed up. And so the book was really formative for me, but the most formative thing that came out of it was that some money came in after her son's death, sort of in a memorial type way, and she wanted to use it to establish a legacy for him that would let his story sort of live beyond his life. And so one of the things they did was go to Ghana, Africa, where she had read a story in the New York Times, of all places, about children who'd been trafficked into the fishing industry. And she used some of that money to help some of those kids. And so I read this book. I didn't know there was kids trafficked. Now trafficking is a buzz thing, but back then nobody was talking about it. I mean, this was 10 years ago, 2009. No one was talking about trafficking at all. And I read this book, was compelled. I called her, asked her could I go to Ghana with you? I want to see this for myself. I was just compelled. And I was pastoring the church in Dallas at the time. And I actually even got in a fight with the guys who were the leaders of the church. They didn't want me to go. And they said, well, I said, I think you guys should support this. I think our church should get involved in this mission. They're like, yeah, I don't know if we really want to do that. And I was like, oh, you know what? I'll take vacation. I only had 10 days of vacation. I was like, I'll take a week of vacation. I'll pay for it out of my own pocket. I'm going. And I don't know if that was the best move by me as an employee of the church, but that's what I said. And they said, no, we're not going to make you do that. We'll pay for it and you can have the vacation, whatever. But I went, and that changed the whole course of my life. I don't think you can sit in a boat with a child who's been sold for $20 or traded for a few chickens and just come back and keep doing life the same way you did it before. So that was really pivotal for me. That was in 2009.
A couple of things. I wasn't sure we were going to be able to come back to this, but the idea of, you were talking about in the book, the boy, 15 years old, went to sleep, never woke up again. You hear a lot of people who are farther along in life talking about like being grateful for, waking up today. And I think that's something you hear more among the older crowd. But truthfully, when people talk about being grateful for every day, and like I'm there now because of stuff like that. Sure. There are people who, tragically, pass away of leukemia at 8 years old or 4 years old, or, or go to sleep and never wake up again. People dying of heart attacks at 26, and that stuff is all really unfortunate, but it really hammers home the point that every single day is a gift.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we do with today. And then conversely, giving yourself permission to, if you want to relax today, it's a really hard line to walk between being grateful for today and not feeling guilty if you don't do something great and grand today. Right. So, and being able to live in both of those worlds at the same time, I think is one of the most important keys to happiness.
Yeah.
So tell us about what Mercy Project does then.
Yeah. So obviously this is 8 years of, life being summarized briefly, but when I went to Ghana, I saw these children had been trafficked. I was compelled. I used the line a lot that my heart was both broken, but also moved, captivated by this reality. And so I came home. My wife was 6 months pregnant with our first child at the time, so she wasn't able to go with me. And I remember just sitting on my couch in the suburbs of Dallas and just weeping and saying, how can we just go back to normal life after you've seen something like this, after you've held the hand of a 12-year-old child slave? How do you just go back to, drinking Starbucks and showing back up at church the next Sunday and preaching another good sermon that everybody kind of claps for, and says, wow, great job, preacher. It's like, no, there's got to be some response to this. I can't just keep doing life. And so she was so gracious, 6 months pregnant, she had so much courage, I think, to say to me, you need to respond to this in the way that feels right to you. I mean, clearly God is asking for a response and your heart is asking for a response. Respond. Don't be afraid of responding. Whatever that means, let's respond. So what that meant the first year was that we fundraised, and the goal was to give the money to another organization and sort of feel like, hey, we did our part. We raised the funds for them to build another house, to rescue a few more kids. And then along the way, what we learned over that year, we were very successful in that fundraising. But what we learned was that no one was solving the problem in a way that felt sustainable to us. And so that brought this new sort of crossroads or Y in the road, which was, okay, can we walk away knowing we gave money to an organization, but we're not really sure if the way they're solving the problem is actually really solving the problem, or do we actually have to create a solution, and then whatever happens there is what happens. And so obviously we chose the second of those two. And so I quit my job at the church, started full-time as Mercy Project's lone employee on September 1st, 2010, literally had no idea what to do. Mm-hmm. I can distinctly remember that third or fourth day sitting in bed. I didn't have a desk, so I would work sitting on my bed. And I remember sitting there like, I don't even know what else to Google. Like I've Googled everything I know how to Google about human trafficking and sustainable solutions. And, I was booked to go back to Ghana 6 weeks later or something, but I was like, what the heck am I supposed to do all day? And now I can't even imagine having a day where I didn't know what to do. But I remember in those first days, it was like, what do you do? I mean, what do you do? And I know anyone who's ever started a business feels this same thing. But early on, just constantly asking that question, like, how do we create a sustainable solution to this? And what that meant first for us was actually understanding the problem. So we spent almost that first entire year figuring out why were the kids being trafficked in the first place, and what were the stories behind their families, and what were the stories of the fishermen who owned them, and just really digging in, and what does this look like around the world, and how is Ghana unique, which Ghana is really unique in so much traffic in the world of trafficking, because there's no one really making money off of trafficking in Ghana like in other places in the world where typically somebody's getting very, very wealthy off of the trafficking. In Ghana, it's a lot of poor people using kids as a tool to help other poor people. I mean, it's just this vicious, the summary, frankly, was that poverty was the enemy. So we thought it was going to be the fishermen that were the enemy that owned the kids. And what we deduced in that first year was that crushing poverty was the enemy. That was the bad guy, which doesn't make a good movie, as you and I once talked about.
Yes.
But it does give you a problem to solve. And so what we began to do was work with these communities, both the parents who sold the children because they were so poor and desperate, and the men who bought the children because they were so poor and desperate, begin working in both those places to come up with a solution that would allow the children to go home and to be free, to go to school, to have a future, to have a life, but also for these fishermen to be able to make money to feed their families, and for the parents who own the kids to be able to afford to own the children. And so that's what we've done over the last 8 years, essentially through aquaculture or cage fishing. We've taught the fishermen a better, more efficient way to fish. They voluntarily release the children. We walk alongside their families once they go back home, make sure the kids have the educational needs supported, help the parents with microloans, parenting classes, whatever they need. So we've done that for 8 years, rescued 124 kids. All of them have gone back to their families. All of them are back in school or the equivalent vocational training.
Do you want to talk about Famous or no?
Yeah, probably not.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the very brief piece of that is my wife and I adopted a little boy from Famous who was part of one of these communities. And after he'd come here and been here just a few months, we discovered pieces of his life that we didn't know existed before, and kind of began to uncover these clues that the story that we understood about his life was not the story the story we understood about his life was not the truth. And so that brought us to a difficult decision where we could sort of bury those clues and pretend that we didn't know them or didn't see them, or we could begin to sort of scrape away the dirt, knowing that every pile of dirt we moved was going to cause more pain for us. And so we chose to know the truth about his story, and good and bad. The truth led us to that he had a family in Ghana that wanted him. And that brought us to the next, terrible decision of do we reunite him with his family and sort of change what feels like what was going to be our family, or do we, keep him here and just sort of let his family not have him? So we reunited him with his family. He lived with us for about 26 months. And then we reunited him back with his family. Now it's been a little over 3 years that he's been back. So were still pretty active in his life and supporting he and his siblings going to school and his parents in some other ways. But yeah, that was tough, man. I'll tell you the one thing that came out of that, a lot of pain, obviously, a lot of pain, but the thing that came out of it, I was on a run with one of my best friends. So we were running, there's moments you have conversations where you not only remember exactly what the person said, but you remember where you were when they said it, right? And we were running up George Bush, which is mostly uphill. If you're a runner, you know this, from Texas towards Wellborn. So I'm huffing and puffing, and we're running, and it was a cool morning. I'm talking to him about Famous, and this is when we're really trying to decide, like, what's the best thing? Do we reunite him with his family? And we sort of have this death in our own family of what both our expectations and our imagination of what this life was going to be like with our son. And I remember I said, I don't know what's best. And my friend said, and this friend is not a guy who, like, he doesn't have a personality that kind of hammers you. And so whenever he's very plain, I'm always paying attention because he's probably errs on the side of being too soft and too not telling it like it is. And he said, when you started Mercy Project, this was at that point 5 years before. He said, when you started Mercy Project, you made the decision of what to do with children who have families. So you already made this decision. 5 years ago, you made a decision that kids who have moms and dads should be with their moms and dads and be empowered to strengthen their family. I know now there's some personal cost to this, but don't feel like you have to remake a decision you made 5 years ago and you've lived out every day since then. And it was like, you're right. We did make that decision. And even though this does come with much more personal loss and pain, we always knew that was right when we started Mercy Project, and it didn't become less right because the little boy lived down the hall from us. So, yeah.
Since founding Mercy Project, you also started a marathon. Is there a second one?
Yeah, we have like a race series. Okay. So races throughout the year, smaller races.
You started a social media company and you wrote a book. You're also doing some public speaking now. What do you think drove you to such a broad set of interests? Is it all about subverting expectations in as many places as you can? Do you just, you see this is where the mountain is highest, so I'm going to go climb that mountain? Or is it something else?
Well, some of it's really functional, to be honest. I mean, you don't make a lot of money running a nonprofit, and I never felt comfortable asking for a lot more money from a nonprofit, but I also never felt comfortable having a lot less money from a nonprofit. So that sort of put the ball back in my court of like, all right, you don't want that and you don't want that. So what do you do now? So some of the ventures came from very functional places of, hey, I've got this talent. Hey, I'd like to make a little bit more money. Let's merge these things. But the marathon I started was a fundraiser for Mercy Project. So I knew I was competing against these huge nonprofits with giant marketing budgets and national, backing, Red Cross and Boys and Girls. So awesome organizations, but I couldn't go toe to toe with them on galas and black tie dinners. And so I was going to start something that didn't feel like a fundraiser, right, but that still raised funds. So that was the marathon. And then it just sort of exploded. And so that was that. The social media company, I love social media. I believe storytelling really matters. I believe every company could do a good job of telling stories, and that's the primary method of marketing should be through storytelling. And so that just kind of came almost accidentally, where companies or businesses saw what I was doing on social media personally and through Mercy Project and said, hey, could you teach us how to do that? And so I did a couple of seminars where people came and paid like $300 for the day. I like way undercharged. I had no idea, but I thought I was like loaded because I made $3,000 in a day. I was like, this is the best day ever. Like, I cannot believe this. But what came out of that even more was that on the way out of one of those seminars, I only did 2. One of the participants sort of whispered to me half jokingly on her way out the door, this was awesome. Why don't I just pay you to do this for me though? Because you're always going to be better at it than me. And so I called her a week later and I said, hey, were you serious about that? And she said, oh my gosh, dead serious. How much would it cost? So then I found this way to have a recurring charge. Every month somebody was paying for us to do this.
Right.
So that's how the social media company started. And I have an employee that does most of the day-to-day of that. And I'm sort of the big picture brains. and vision of that or whatever. And then the book, I'd always wanted to write a book. I love speaking. I got the advice from several people that even though I'm consider myself more of a speaker who writes than a writer who speaks, that I needed a topic. I needed something, and it couldn't be Mercy Project because then it felt like a sales pitch for my nonprofit. And so I sort of had this idea of these stories of people sort of responding to need, taking action when they saw a problem. And always the word disruption had always been one that had resonated with me over the last several years since a friend had introduced me to that word in a positive way. Mm-hmm. And I realized it really kind of gave a name for much of my life, which is like, oh, that's what I've been doing. I've been disrupting, but not in the way we think of that as a negative connotation, when really disruption is a neutral. It's just to stop the normal continuance of something. So it's not positive. It's not negative. It's when something is going and the normal path is not good enough, it's saying that's not okay. I'm going to create something better. So there's been all these moments in history where someone has disrupted the normal continuance and it's made us better, right? We wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation that can somehow magically end up on the internet if somebody hadn't disrupted the way we thought about computers and microphones and recording and all of that, right? And so all of these moments have been disrupted. So I took this idea that had been typically negative, and then in the business world, people talk about disruption all the time.
Sure.
And it almost gotten overused in the business world. But what I was fascinated by was I wasn't in the business world. No one outside the business world knew it. So everyone in business is like, oh, disruption. Yeah. We've heard that. And it's like all these other spaces are like, disruption. We thought that was when you were, speaking out in Sunday school, you were being a disruption. So I could take this idea that the business world had almost pushed to the side, like old, boring, archaic, and now bring it to teachers and bring it to pastors and bring it to students and all of these other sort of industries that were like, whoa, this is a new cool thing. And then to put my spin on it, Disrupting for Good is the name of the book I wrote, which is really just a bunch of ordinary people, not famous, not impressive in their resume, except they saw a problem and they responded.
So when you talk about disruption, how do you characterize it in the broadest possible sense? When you think about what in your life needs disrupting and how would you disrupt it? Like, how do you present that to people in what are the 10 or 20 or 50 words that you use to say, think about it in this way, look for opportunities in this way, and then when you see one, this is how you address it.
Yeah, so it's even less than 50 words. If there's some truth in your life that makes you uncomfortable, mm-hmm. you need to create a new truth. You need to disrupt the truth. So even in this room, there's a few of us here, right? And I would say if I had 10 minutes with you, we'd figure out some truth that makes you uncomfortable. Something in your life that you don't love, a relationship that could be better, you don't love that you're not healthy in some way, maybe mental health, physical health. You don't like that you don't try your hardest at something, or your marriage isn't as strong as it could be, or your relationship with your parents, or you hate your work. You dread getting up every day because you hate your job. There's something in your life that needs to be disrupted. Every single one of us, some truth that makes us uncomfortable. So disruption is showing up and creating a new and better truth and staying every day, persisting until that new and better truth has been created. So I find that it's so universal because any person sitting in a room has some truth. Now, sometimes it's this huge truth, like, man, I hate the death penalty and I think it should be abolished in America. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a big, uncomfortable truth. Mm-hmm. What are you doing in Brazos County to help abolish the death penalty, right? Like in the context with the control and the power and the leverage you have, what are you doing in Brazos County? Up to somebody saying, I'm just, so for me as a dad, I'm uncomfortable with the truth of the way like my technology and my phone distracts me from being present with my children. Mm-hmm. So I have to be honest about, am I willing to do something about that? Does it make me uncomfortable enough for action? And if so, what's that action going to be? So maybe it's, when I get home from work, I put my phone in my room so that it's not in my pocket. Mm-hmm. And I'm not beholden to this device because honestly, I'm not as important as I like to think I'm super important. I'm not actually that important. And I can convince and qualify and justify that I am so important. People might need me at any moment. I run these important organizations. That's not true. If anyone needed me that badly, they could come to my house and knock on my door and tell me that they need me, right? Or they could call my wife's phone or whatever. They could get a hold of me. So it's just my own releasing of control is why I like to always have my phone, but that's costing me something with my kids. And so I've got to be honest, which of those things matters more to me? And in my best, I want to be present with my kids. But just like understanding our privilege, we can't just acknowledge, I want to be better with my kids. No, that should push us to some sort of action. And so I think that's a question. We all have truths we're uncomfortable with. Which ones of those are we willing to work at and persist at to create a new and better truth? Because that's the hard work.
How do you help people establish effective time horizons for the things that they want to change? Because when you talked about the death penalty a second ago, obviously that's one that you could work your whole life and only make incremental progress toward the change you want to see in the world. So then there's something like somebody could say, I would like to lose 5 pounds.
Yeah. Or run a marathon
Right. So, and then there's everything in between.
Right.
So how do you help people figure out this is because for most goals, it's important to have at least some aspect of the goal that's time oriented.
100%.
So how do you help people figure out what their time horizons are?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think some of that solves itself depending on what is that truth they're uncomfortable with. I think it's less solving the time horizon and more being honest about what that path looks like to get there. So someone says, I want to abolish the death penalty. Like, okay, there's a chance that may never happen in your lifetime. What are the wins we can get today that make the effort feel worth it for you? So do you know any families who've been personally affected by the death penalty? Well, no, I don't. I read a book. Well, let's find a family that's been personally impacted by the death penalty and understand what could have been helpful to them along the way. Let's talk to lawyers and organizations like the one out of Birmingham that I just read the book, Just Mercy. There's a book, Just Mercy, that was written, and the guy spent his whole career as a lawyer basically getting people off the death penalty that should have never been on the death penalty in the first place. Powerfully painful book, frankly. But there's these organizations, they're already experts in this topic. So go make yourself an expert in that topic, and that's going to show you where the gaps are for you to actually leverage your skills and your problem solve. I never set out to rescue kids out of slavery in Ghana. Remember, I set out to raise money to empower somebody else, which if I believed they had been doing a great job, it would have ended there for me. They weren't doing what I thought needed to be done, so I had to step into that gap. But I would have never known that gap existed if I hadn't shown up in Ghana and started raising money. Mm-hmm. And so if you hate the death penalty or you want to abolish the death penalty, you got to actually get around people who know more about the death penalty than you do. And that's going to show you where those gaps are, right? And then in those gaps, you can decide what does it look like today and this week and this month and this year to get a win for abolishing the death penalty. It might be convincing one judge or, whatever that thing, it might be writing every legislate, whatever, I don't know what those things are, but there are those incremental steps.
So you're a guy who is trying in a very real sense to be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah, of course.
And there are many changes that you want to see in the world. So I would imagine that one of the biggest challenges for you is time management. What are the most important things that have surprised you about effective time management?
Yeah, so I think the first is I've had to learn to say no much more than I ever thought I would. And especially when I started Mercy Project, I said yes to everything. Mm-hmm. Anybody wanted me to speak, preach, talk, pray, show up. I was like, I would drive to Houston to speak to a class of elementary school students. I mean, Dallas. I drove to Dallas and spoke to a class of 7-year-olds. Like, I can't even imagine having the time now, to be able, not that those 7-year-olds don't matter, but my scope of the best use of my time has changed. And I always tell the students in my class here at Mays, every decision you make, every yes you make is you're saying no to 1,000 other things.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah, that shouldn't scare you, but don't kid yourself about that. Don't lie to yourself that saying yes to this doesn't have a downstream effect of all those other things. Mm-hmm. What I think it does, it makes your yeses more meaningful and it makes your yeses more impactful. And so I like to look at my schedule and say, do I feel really good about everything I'm saying yes to? Are all the things I'm saying yes to the most meaningful, highest impact things I could say yes to? And the truth is, when you start doing that, you start knocking a bunch of stuff off, right? Because you're doing it out of duty, or you're doing it out of habit, or you're doing it because that's what you've always done, or you thought you had to. And so for me, it's been from a time management standpoint, constantly, probably every 3 to 6 months, I will measure how I spend my time. I've got an app, and I'll measure how I'm spending my time over about a 2-week period. And I'll look at those numbers and say, gosh, 20% of my time is going to this. That has no bottom line effect on this goal that I have. I've got to cut that 20% out. And I'm constantly measuring what that looks like for me and how that time is spent. That app is called Hours Tracker, by the way. And it's just a simple, probably lawyers and accountants and other people use it all the time who bill. See, but I don't have anyone I'm responsible to bill except Chris Field. And most of us are not lawyers or accountants who have to bill a client. But what we don't understand is that we're billing ourselves from future success.
Right.
The person we want to become, that's who we should be billing. Right. And if we had the urgency to bill ourselves the way lawyers would bill their clients, we'd all be better people because we'd be a lot more intentional. Lawyers that are getting paid hundreds of dollars an hour, they don't waste a lot of time on Facebook. Right?
Yes.
Because they need to apply their time as being spent to a client because there's an immediate cost benefit for them.
Right.
We all have that same cost benefit. We just, it's further down the road. We just don't think about it in those terms.
So let me push back on that a little bit. You spend a fair bit of time on Facebook.
Yeah.
But I would also say that your time spent on Facebook is very high impact for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier. There's a thing about you that is fairly unique. And I can talk a little bit about this because you and I have social media presences. I'm not as active as I used to be on Facebook, but you and I have social media presences that are very different in some ways, very similar in others. But how would you describe your voice on social media? What is it that makes you say the things that you say about everything from the death penalty? I don't know if you post about the death penalty specifically, but you talk a lot about political things and religious things. And you also talk a lot about Bluebell ice cream.
I do.
So how do you characterize all of that? How do you wrap that all up in one nice, neat package?
Yeah, I don't know if I do in a nice, neat package. I believe social media gives us unprecedented capability to have a message that's heard by many people. I mean, when you think about, I don't know, I have 3,000 friends or something on my personal Facebook page, and then I have a public Facebook page that has a little over 8,000 people. So at any point in the day, for me to be able to touch 10,000 people, that's asinine. I mean, think about it. There's no point in history where any Yahoo like me could say something that thousands of people would have to listen to. Now they could hide me or unfollow me. That's fine. And that happens, I'm sure.
Right. But
that's unprecedented.
And it's an informational meritocracy now.
Yes.
Like just the fact that you're you and I are like Yahoos, we have, but yet because of the meritocratization of information and platform, you have a platform
That's
now.
right.
So anyway, continue.
So now you have to choose. Am I going to leverage that for good, or am I going to leverage that for evil, right? And so what we see on Facebook is so much of it's negative, and it's so poorly done, and it's people spouting off on things that they have no understanding of, and almost using Facebook like their diary.
Yeah, not as bad as Twitter, though.
No, not as bad as Twitter, but where they're
like I always do.
They're angry about something, and so they just go, straight there. And the truth is that I view it, I see the power of social media, particularly Facebook is sort of the medium that I'm on the most. And I wanted to leverage that power for good, just like in my book, that what if we had better conversations? And what if we engaged each other with more humanity? And what if we looked at both sides of an issue? And what if we weren't so darn predictable? And what if we didn't post fake news stories that we hadn't looked up, or that we never even clarified, but our great uncle in, Massachusetts had posted it. And so we're going to share it. And so really on social media, I just want to ask better questions. And, I have an interesting group of people on social media on my personal page, because my conservative friends think I'm a crazy liberal and my liberal friends think I'm a crazy conservative.
Exactly.
And so but while that balance can be painful, I do love to think that sometimes I'm the only voice presenting the information I'm presenting. And so there's times I'm very, try to agitate on social media in a positive way, but I try to do it in a way that I never lose credibility with people, that they'll just dismiss my voice, because the echo chamber of our lives, not sitting around the table with people different than us, that is causing so much pain and polarization in America. And that, going back to the superpower, we don't know our stories. And so when we talk about people of color, if you're talking about people of color from news and not from sitting at a table and talking to people of color, you're not going to tell that story in the same way than if you've actually sat down and listened to the experience and life stories of somebody. And so when I get a chance, as I did a couple of years ago, as uncomfortable as it felt for me to speak on behalf of so many of my friends of color about some of the ways they still experienced racism in 2017, I took that opportunity, even though it was very uncomfortable for so many of my white friends, and I got a lot of pushback. It felt important to do that. And when we could talk about politics and when everything's so charged and polarized, anytime you get a chance, I think, to tell those stories in a way that brings levity and sort of highlights the humanity and the shared humanity, I think it's a win. It's a win for everybody if they have to think differently.
What changed my mind on gay marriage was I had a gay friend in college, and I had been brought up to believe that being gay was a sin, and that it was a choice.
Right.
And I met this guy in college. We were in the same O Week group. His name is Alex. Hi, Alex. And I talked with him a little bit about it. I just asked him some questions because I wanted to know what went through the mind of a person who chose to, from where I was sitting at that time, who chose to embark on this sinful behavior. And I said, when did you know you were gay? Like, sort of as a, kind of an off the cuff question. And he said, when I was 5. And I said, when you were 5? And it just, his honesty about the whole thing, and some of the questions, I could see that he was a little bit embarrassed by the answers, but it was obvious that he was telling the truth.
Right.
And it shook my worldview. And I had to reconsider all of these things. I also read a book about the biology of being gay and the epigenetics of it and so forth. And that was, but I was proud of myself that in those moments I thought critically about my view of the world. And I was willing to say, is this right because it's actually right? Or is it right because it's just what I've always been told?
Right.
And so that, I think, plays to the reason that I think your voice, people want to hear your voice on Facebook or wherever else. And the reason you come off as authentic is because people don't know exactly what you're going to say. And you are constantly reconsidering the things that you believe and saying, is this really, you're questioning yourself all the time. And the 10% of people that I pay attention to in my own Facebook discussions, and the standard that I hold myself to as well, is, can people figure out before I ever say anything what it is that I'm going to say, just because they know what I always say.
Right.
And avoiding becoming one note like that is an exercise in constant critical thinking and constant critical rethinking, and challenging yourself sometimes to take a contrarian view to your own beliefs,
right,
and to come at yourself. There's sort of a dissociative element of it, where you're having a conversation or an argument even with yourself, and sometimes the answer is, I don't know.
Right.
And being able to be honest and say, a reasonable person could take both sides of this issue.
Right.
And for me, what Facebook was about was finding that spot where a reasonable person could 50-50 come at it from either side, that was where the really interesting discussion was. And people would do that.
Right.
And exactly as the same experience that you had, my more liberal, progressive, whatever, my more left-minded friends thought that I was a crazy right-winger, and my more conservative friends thought that I was a crazy left-winger, and that all of my really, really out there left-wing, anyway.
Yeah.
But there's a magic in being able to think from both sides, and to say, when you decide where you land on those issues, to say to someone who's on the other side, I disagree with you with every fiber of my being, and I love you anyway.
Right.
And you're really good at that.
Well, I mean, I try to do that. Sometimes it's forced. I don't always feel a lot of love for those people, but I have found it's easy to hate what you don't know. And the more you zoom in, the harder it is to hate. And so for you, that experience was actually engaging a friendship with someone who was gay. And it's easy to think about gay people a certain way until you know gay people, real people who are gay and who identify as gay. And then it's a lot harder to paint those folks with a broad brush when they're actually your friends and neighbors, and they're sitting at your table and they're, playing with your kids and doing life with you. Then it's a lot harder to dislike them, as some people tend to do.
That sort of thinking is very in vogue now. And sometimes, so constantly pushing back on myself, I challenge myself to think of, like, what's the opposite of that? Yeah. So not necessarily like neo-Nazis.
Sure.
I think that there's some inherent bad to something like that. Right. But someone that's not quite that far along the spectrum, that takes a much more conservative approach to certain things, a view that is maybe not popular in today's social media climb. How can I understand that person and why they think the way they do, and what it is that they're afraid of, what makes them brave?
Sure.
Do you feel your presence on social media has changed as a result of the current political climate and socio-media political climate as well?
Yeah, I don't know if it has or not. I mean, I think it's become even more important to tell good stories, because the news cycle seems to be dominated by negative stories. And so my sense from social media is that people are hungry for positive stuff. And so I think being the kind of people and the kind of person who finds the positive stuff and names it and pushes it out and shares it and wants to be involved in that is, I think people are hungry. I think they're hungry for that, hungry for stuff that matters and stuff that's positive and to see good. I think it's easy for us to see so much negativity. Seeing the good is something that it's like a muscle. You have to, I tell people generosity is a muscle. You have to exercise it. People say, I'm just not naturally generous. I'm like, yeah, sure. You have to practice being generous. Just like that's a muscle. You have to exercise. Not good at being generous, be generous.
Right.
And over time you realize, oh my gosh, I'm really generous all of a sudden. Right. And it's the same. If I walked out of this building today and I had no agenda, but to walk around, drive around Bryan College Station and find good stories, I'd find 100. Literally. I'd find 100 stories that are good, rich stories that really matter. Just like the story I shared last week about the single mom who is in a really tough place right now that needed a car, and we crowdfunded to buy her a car and took it to her on Friday. And like those stories they're everywhere. They're in this building. I mean, I could find great stories in this building. You just have to know what you're looking for and to slow down enough to see and respond to those stories when you find them, to leave enough margin in your life, both in your heart and in your schedule, that you'll slow down. And my sense is that what people have responded to with me, people trust me to tell them about stories that matter, that they may not have the time or energy to find themselves. And then they get to participate. And so what I've had to do is find these stories and then share them. so that it invites more people into the story instead of me just keeping it to myself, which at times would be easier and would keep me. I'm sure there's people who think I share these stories because I want some sort of kudos or, like, oh, Chris is telling the world of his good deeds. I fight that, knowing there's people who think that makes me feel insanely crazy. But I think that's way outweighed by the 100 people who gave to the GoFundMe who would never have met this single mom otherwise, or even known. There's people in Bryan College Station who don't have cars because they did a car title loan that charged 376% interest rate. Yeah, so all of a sudden, not only do they give $50 of their hard-earned money, but they've been exposed to a reality of poverty that they never even knew existed.
Right.
And now they're more gentle. The next time they see a single mom at HEB with their kids, they think this might be like the story Chris told, right? So I've got to trust that outweighs the 5 people who view that stuff I write and think, oh my gosh, here's Chris trying to make himself the hero again, right? Because I struggle with that. I don't want people to ever feel like that. But I know there's hundreds of people that their Thanksgiving was more meaningful because they got to help a single mom have a car that wouldn't have gotten to do that if I hadn't taken the time to share the story.
So you mentioned earlier, so let me dig a little bit into something you just said. You mentioned earlier that you struggle sometimes with wanting to feel like you are important or significant in some way. And that's what makes you, one of your challenges is having your phone on, because maybe there is some part of you that wants this confirmation that says, Chris, we need you.
Right.
Like there is some important function that you're fulfilling that no one else is fulfilling. Yeah. And the world will not be as good if you're not doing that thing. So how do you deal with that shadow side?
I think you just name it. Mm-hmm. And, a wise friend once told me years ago that our greatest weakness is also our greatest strength. And so for me, confidence and arrogance are 2 sides of the same coin. And I like to joke, people who like me think I'm confident and people who don't like me think I'm arrogant. Same behaviors by me.
Right.
And some of that's true, but that's also a little bit of like letting myself off the hook. I just have to be honest about my intentions, and I have to be honest about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and who I'm doing it for. And, I think we've lost the ability to self-reflect because our society is everything's so urgent that this is where running has been so critical for me, is that I run with no headphones, no iPod, no podcasts. It's just me. And so I have, I average about an hour a day of running, and I have an hour a day of just thinking and self-reflecting and asking myself honest, hard questions about Chris Field and my role as a father and my role as a husband and my role as a professor and my role as a nonprofit leader and just my role as a human being. And I'm constantly, I actually would say, we don't have time for this now. It's probably lame time for me to bring it up, but I would actually say self-reflection is one of the things that differentiates me from the vast majority of my peers. And people ask why I feel like I've been successful. It's because I'm constantly, even if somebody comes to me with hard feedback, I already know it before they bring it to me. I know those things I'm not good at. I could name 1 time out of 100 that I've been surprised by feedback that I don't like because I already know that thing about myself. So that self-awareness sucks because I have to deal with it. I know these worst things about, like, I envy people sometimes who are just so aloof that they're just like, this is awesome, man. It's like, hey, this thing. And they're like, what? I did that? No way. That almost never happened. I know when I've hurt someone, when I've stepped that line, I know it. Mm-hmm. And so I have that ability to self-reflect, which sucks, but it also lets me deal with those things and be honest and reach out to those people for reconciliation and to try to mend those relationships instead of letting them get like so bad that they're irreparable.
Have you met John Krychek?
I have not. Yeah. He was my neighbor in Duck Haven. John. Yeah.
We should do, so I'm going to break the fourth wall for a moment. We should do a 3-person pod with you and Krychek at some point.
It's great.
I think the 2 of you talking to each other would be something.
Yeah, he seems like a super cool guy.
He is unquestionably a super cool guy. You talked a little bit about introspection, and I think for some people, as you said, that's really challenging because some people I think, do best or interact best when they have something else out there to interact with, whether it's something that they want to pull toward them or something that they want to push away from them.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that social media has taken on the very adversarial feel that it has is because for one reason or another, when we are most likely to, the times when we are most likely to take action are when we feel we have an enemy. And people have defined themselves not necessarily by who they feel they are at their innermost self or even who they feel their friends are, but who they feel their enemies are. And I believe, I'm going to say this on the air, I believe the reason that Donald Trump got elected president was because people decided that the enemy of their enemy was their friend. And so I'm not sure what we do with that, but I think that you take a different approach in the sense that your posts are mostly about how can I think about who I am today and who do I want to put around me, because I am the sum of the 5 people that I am hanging out with today.
Right.
And I think you're really interesting in that you're a bit of a chameleon in that way, in that you have a broad enough circle that you can sort of say, this is the person I want to be today. And then this is the person that I should be tomorrow. And this is the person I'm going to be next week. And all of those are the same guy. There's not a dishonesty inherent in that, but there is a constant evolution.
Yeah.
That's the way I would describe the way
I think you're right. And I think the Donald Trump comment, I think America has got to stop being so scared. Like we're not our best when we live out of fear.
What is it that we're scared of?
We don't even know. We're scared of the fact that we don't know what we're scared of. But when we live out of fear, it's not our best selves. I mean, I almost never, if I look at my life, my best decisions in life, they don't come when I'm scared. And I don't mean like a guy pulled a gun on me and so I ran really fast and jumped over a fence and that was awesome. And that stuff doesn't happen to me. But when I make decisions out of fear rather than out of love, or rather than out of hope, they're just not great decisions because they're almost never with all the facts. They're almost always just slanted by, there's even data that shows that when someone experiences a traumatic situation, that what they remember about that situation may not even be real, right? That their memory of that situation, one, is so zoomed in because of the risk and the fear. You see it in court testimony. Right. But even the zoomed in version may be full of data that actually wasn't real data, right? Something about the way our bodies respond to fear. Right. So when we think about that from a decision-making standpoint, when we vote out of fear, or we respond in conversation at the Thanksgiving table out of fear, or we respond to a poor person who needs our help, or we respond to a person who has a different life experience than us because they're gay, or because they're a person of color, or because they're a female when I'm a male, or because they're Muslim when I'm Christian, whatever the thing is, if we're making that decision out of fear, we don't have all the data points, and the ones we do have may not even be accurate. That's a really bad place to make decisions out of. I mean, a really historically bad place. So given the fact that effective feedback is always about do this rather than don't do that. Right. You don't want to tell you, it's not effective teaching to tell people stop doing this. Right. You instead want to tell them do that instead. So what would you tell a person who is, for example, voting out of fear? Well, how would you tell them to improve their lives and to improve what they're contributing to society? Yeah, the first thing I would say is what a mentor told me a decade ago, which is run towards something, not away. Okay. So don't make decisions based on what you're scared of. Make decisions on what you want to, where you want to be going, and not where you don't want to be going, right? So, I'm scared to go right, so I'm going to run as fast as I can left. Or I'm scared to go backwards, so I'm going to run as fast as I can forward. Well, who knows? Wouldn't it be better to find the thing where you want to be going and pursue that wholeheartedly rather than just running away and hoping where you end up is the right place? So I would say, I mean, there's not some like Socratic answer here that's going to be like so deep and meaningful. I think it's being honest about what drives you to make decisions. And if you are making decisions out of fear, Is it because you actually have reason to feel fear, or because you've been told you should feel fearful? And if it's the latter, then go deal with what's making you feel fearful. Go find those kind of people, if you will, and engage them. And if they hurt you or steal your money or steal your liberties, then maybe you have reason to be justified. But my perception and my life experience is that gay people don't care who I marry, and that people of color don't care that necessarily that I have not had the same experience as them. They're not asking me to have the same experience as them. They're asking me to understand that their experience is different than mine. And so I think it's actually engaging people who are different than you and who don't think and act and feel the same ways you do, but engaging them out of a sincere desire instead of out of staying away from them out of fear.
Plug your stuff. How can people find Mercy Project? How can they buy your book? Where would you like them to go look?
Yeah, so Mercy Project is pretty easy, mercyproject.net. And you can find the book, Disrupting for Good, on Amazon. It's on Kindle, paperback, and also I recorded an Audible version, so they can find all of those there. And that's pretty much it. I have a little website, meetchrisfield.com, where they can look at speaking opportunities if they want to bring me in to speak or whatever. But yeah, man, pretty straightforward.
That's very you. We end each session with Good Bull, an opportunity to recognize someone else for something good or great that they've done. Do you have anyone you would like to send some Good Bull?
I think for me, I think of all the people that have impacted me that don't, and have impacted so many others that they don't get to do cool things like podcasts, but that their fingerprints are all over any good story that's ever come out of someone's life. So all of the teachers that we know who will never make a podcast and will hardly make this month's mortgage payment, the Sunday school teachers, the friends, my friends' parents, like from high school and junior high, who believed in me and who spoke truth over my life. I mean, my own parents who will never make it onto a podcast, but who spoke truth over me. So for me, I think I love knowing that every good story, every good life, anyone who makes the news, anyone who makes a book or television, or who even makes it to a place of prominence in a business school, the fingerprints of 1,000 people are on that person's life. And if they weren't, that person wouldn't be where they were. And so for me, I love thinking about those people in my life, and maybe you and anyone who listens to this, even just reaching out to those people and saying, I am who I am because of you. And I hope you take pride and joy in knowing that you're shaping kids' lives in Ghana because you chose to believe in me in second grade and to see something in me that I could become even before I saw it in myself.
You are my dude, Chris. Thank you for taking the time to appear on the show.
Yeah, man. This is awesome.
And thanks to the listeners for tuning in. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to stay up to date on our latest videos, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to receive notifications. If you're in a rush or on the road, you can still join us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you want to learn more about us or our guests, please visit our website at mays.tamu.edu/podcasts. Also, please check out Mays Business School's academic programs. They're the sponsors of our show, and you can find them in the description. Thanks, and gig 'em.